This is part two of the presentation I began in my last lecture on water into wine, Johannine Hermeneutics, and the Alexandrian tradition. I mentioned last time two key works that were essential to read in terms of interpreting the text. One was Augustine, the second one was Erasmus. Erasmus' 1516 translation of the New Testaments broke all sorts of new ground in terms of interpretation. He had Hebrew text, Greek, and Latin. But in that 1516 text, he proposed a method by which interpretation could take place. That short little excerpt in the 1516 text became so popular, he wrote a much bigger one, which I mentioned last week, in which it's reflections on how to interpret the text, or true theology in that sense. The point I want to note here in terms of Erasmus and the future direction of biblical exegesis is, on the one hand, Erasmus paved the way for a solid literal, grammatical, historic, linguistic approach to interpreting the Bible. So he cannot be accused of flights of fancy in terms of allegory, typology, and a variety of other levels of interpretation. But it should be noted, and this is probably significant to get right at the outset, when he did the 1519, in terms of how you interpret the text, the reflections on true exegesis or theology, he turned to one of the most important exegetes in the early Christian tradition, and that is Origen. I want to read you two things from Erasmus. He talks about, of all the great exegetes of the church, he says, the chief among these is Origen, who so began to weave this lovely web that no one after him dared to put a hand to it. And so he moves on near the end also, where he talks about those who had done exegesis of the texts. He says, rather let the labor of the ancients save us from the part of the work. Let us find assistance in their commentaries. Provide first that we choose the best of them. For example, Origen, who is so far ahead that no one else can be compared to him. After him, Basil, Nazianzen, Athanasius, Cyril, Chrysostom, Jerome, Ambrose, Hilary, Augustine. And so what you have in someone like Erasmus, he's very clear that even though he's at the forefront of articulating a turn to a literal grammatical exegesis, in fact, that is but the door, that is but the key, that is but the portal into a much deeper, a more layered way of exegesis, of which Origen, he points to, seems to be the pioneer. There is also the tendency to assume within Alexandria that someone like Philo, with his layered exegesis of the Hebrew canon, was the one who set the stage for people like Pentinus, Clement, and Origen. But in fact, what I want to reflect on a little bit today is that this layered way of exegesis had a much older history within the Mediterranean himself. And all of Alexandria does, it was just standing on the shoulders of a much older Greek tradition of which it was drawing from. And so the notion that the somehow Philo shaped Alexandrian Christianity exegesis, and that somehow there's a disconnect between layered exegesis and the book of John, is just not true. And so John, in that sense, drawing from Jesus himself, is working out of a layered exegesis. And I'll finish these reflections on. I want to return to Cana again, because that's a very compact text in which there's a multiplicity of ways of understanding what Jesus is doing, and John's reflection on it. Origen himself did 32 books on John itself, or 32 chapters, what we call today. And so it was a very important book to Origen, and he's just drawing from John, who's drawing from Jesus, a much bigger tradition. So let me go a little bit back in history intellectually. I'll move very quickly through it because I don't want to linger, particularly on the Greek tradition of Plato and Aristotle. But one of the things that was presented to the philosophers of Plato and Aristotle, or classical age, is they, whether from Homer or Hesiod, or just the multiplicity of Greek myths, is were they to read these myths literally, or were they allegories or types or figures that said more about the human journey than they did about some objective reality called the gods? And so many of the philosophers at the time of Plato and Aristotle, their key book was Homer and Hesiod, and of course the gods factor largely into that. The philosophers basically said, we can't take these gods literally, but what do they say about our human condition? So let me just look at a few of those reflections philosophically of how they interpreted Homer, Hesiod, Greek myths in quite different than a literal way or literal grammatical historic way. And once we get a sense of what's going on in classical Greece, we can see this whole tradition being passed on to Athens and Constantinople and Alexandria and many other places, so that it was just the air they breathed in terms of exegesis. And so Jesus himself would have been a part of that as he applies it to himself, and John reflects on that in the book of John. So, for example, the philosophers at the time of Homer, or shortly after, are looking at these gods. So let's just look at a few of them. Kronos. Now, did the whole notion of the Greek god Kronos, who swallows its own or eats its own? Kronos is just time. Now, did the Greek philosophers actually believe there was a god up there who ate people? Well, of course not. They were not that simple in terms of seeing Kronos as a literal god who devoured people. They were looking at the nature of time itself. We all live through a short period of time, or 70 or 10 or more or less, and then we pass off the stage of life. So Kronos merely becomes a projection onto the screen for them of the nature of the human journey, the beginning and then the end, and that we do move off the stage in that sense. It's not a literal being who eats up people like a cannibal. None of the philosophers would have interpreted Greek myth that way. The other would be Zeus and Hera. Obviously, many people throughout history within the context of marriage have tensions in marriage. They have difficulties, they have clashes. So what's going on with Zeus and Hera? You've got very much a family in which husband and wife are often not on the same page together. Okay, so what are these myths about? They project the human experience on the screen of the mythic gods. And in that sense, they obviously don't think there's a Zeus up there and a Hera up there fighting with one another. It's a projection of the human condition of relationships within the context of marriage itself. Hera has a difficulty with one of her children, Hephaestus. She can be quite nasty to him. She casts him to the earth and he becomes a cripple. Well, how many children become cripples emotionally as a result of mistreatment by their parents? So is it an actual, in this case, is it a situation in which they believe in a Hera throwing her sibling or her child to the earth and the consequences? No, it's a reflection on the nature of human relationships, the dynamic in relationship, what happens when there's dysfunctions between husbands and wife, parents and children. Look at Hercules, for example, in his battle against the Hydra. Did the Greeks actually believe there was a literal hydra with multiple heads and you could cut the heads off and new ones would grow? Well, of course not. It was a study of human desire. And so we can have desires. They can be physical desires. They can be desires of fear, desires of insecurity, longing for power. There's the many heads of desire, and we can cut off a head which seemingly deals with it, but it grows back more two heads. And so the humans on their search and journey for life, like Hercules, have to cut off the heads, but it grows right back. And there's many desires which collide, and it's Hercules through a friend who assists in the overcoming of this. The sirens, the many voices within us. Well, obviously they're objectified in myth, but in fact all those objectified myths are subjective realities. So the desires that pull people to and fro internally, they're the sirens of Greek myth. And so a very subtle and sophisticated understanding of the dynamics of human desire in terms of the sirens. The Trojan War, for example, Paris is offered the opportunity he can go in three directions. Athena offers his wisdom and insight if she chooses him, because he's offered a choice of three women in terms of his future. You have Aphrodite, who offers him purely sensual and sexual desires and beauty and image. That's all it is. And then you have Hera, who offers him power. So which will he choose? Now, are these actual three literal gods that Paris has to choose from, or are they the nature of humans having to choose what level of my desires am I going to choose from? What are going to be the consequences of that? Paris chooses Aphrodite. He's a bit of a cad and a fop himself. And out of this, the Trojan War emerges. And so when we look at Greek myths, and I could go on with many of them in terms of their multiple stories, they were never read literally in that sense. They were always read figuratively, allegory, and they said more about the human condition and human desire. So if you look at that Greek model of how you interpret texts that was foundational to classical civilization, would have been an Athenian education, Alexandria, Constantinople, any of these places. Fast forward that to the time of the Jews in Alexandria. And Philo of Alexandria, was he initiating these layered interpretations in his case of the Hebrew canon or the Old Testament? Or is he building on an old tradition of, yes, there is the literal, but there are other layers of interpretation of the text itself? And so he's standing, as I mentioned earlier, on the shoulders of those who have gone before him. So when he turns to the Old Testament for exegesis, for example, Genesis, does he think Genesis is literally about a certain time period in which we can date the earth in young earth, or is it about an allegory of order and chaos? What's the role of 6 days? What's the role of the seventh? Does God need to rest? Well, of course, God doesn't need to rest. What's the relationship of work and rest and the tension between things like this? And so what Philo is doing is he goes through various elements of the Old Testament. He's looking at both the historical and the literal, the Jewish Exodus. Yes, that's a literal historical, but there's much more to it in terms of the soul's exodus from the Egypt of the false self, going through the desert where that has to be let go of, into the promised land. Philo, for example, will take in the of Numbers, in which Moses asks them to go into Canaan and say, can we just move in there? Who might be our threats? And three of the major giants that they see, which put the fear in the Israelites, saying, listen, we can't go in, this is a land of giants. What Philo does with that? Well, what are the giants of fears within us which paralyze us from going where we're meant to be into the new promised land? He does the same thing with this. It goes through Numbers and then to Joshua and Judges as they have to meet the giants. And so Philo will say it's not that I'm going to deny the historical, literal, but this can be interpreted personally, existentially, or even ontologically in terms of understanding our being. And what are the fears? What are the securities? What are the giants we fear within us facing? Hence we retreat from moving forward in our journey. Jerusalem. There can be literal Jerusalem, and Jerusalem can be also interpreted as that place of peace in the heart. And if we don't understand the Jerusalem within, we can have peace in the external, physical Jerusalem, but miss it, in fact, in the internal Jerusalem. And so Philo, and I could go on with a lot of Philo's work in his many writings, but he's bringing together that classical understanding of interpreting texts in not only a literal grammatical, he doesn't deny that, but he says it has a typological, a tropological way, which is very personal and ontological. It speaks to our being. It calls forth our very being to move in a much more genuine, authentic way in terms of overcoming those giants within, that hydra within, those sirens within, which can prevent us from being truly free in that sense, free from the Egypt of our own imprisonment. And so when we move forward from Philo, as I mentioned earlier, to someone like Origen, who does this long commentary on John, John really is standing himself within a tradition, as is Jesus in interpreting the text in a certain way. Now let me come to John and come back to John 2, which I started in the Cana of Galilee story last week, and I want to look at 8 elements of that particular story that bring together not only a literal, grammatical, historic, because it can be read in that way. Jesus is invited to a wedding, Cana of Galilee. The pots are full of water. His mother comes to him and says, what can be done here? This could turn into a tragedy, this wedding. It can be read simply in that way, and no one would deny that, but there's other hints or suggestions. And so what John is doing, drawing from Jesus, and which Origen will pick up on in his 32 chapters or books on John itself, he's going to touch on these things, and they're like, if I can see them, as crumbs on the trail, fingers pointing to the moon, keys. Now, if you're just a literal grammatical, you can spend all your time looking at the key and what kind of metal it is and how is it shaped and who built it and who designed it, or finger pointing to the moon, what's the nature of the skin and the nails, and one can spend a lot of time on the literal, or the crumbs, what sort of material were they put together with. And that's what often literalists do. They focus on the finger that points to the moon, not the moon, the key that's meant to open the door into something else, but they spend their time at the door and the key rather than going through the door into the meaning of the text or the spirit of the text in that sense. And so what John is doing in Cana is giving the reader a key pointing to crumbs on the trail that will take people to the home of their soul, in that sense, finger pointing to the moon. I want to just touch on 8 of these now, and then we can bring this to an end. First of all, as I mentioned last week, it starts off on the 3rd day. 2 things about the 3rd day. First of all, 3 takes you into the nature of the death and resurrection of Jesus. So we all, like Christ, have to die to what we are not. We go into the grave and we are reborn phoenix-like. What into? 3 is also the number of the Trinity. So we move into the very nature, and we are united with the very nature of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And so 3, he's signaling already, here's a key. If you take that key into our own journey, our own experience, what does it mean to let go, to die, to be reborn in Christ, and to unite with or be one with the very being of God? 6 jars. Why 6? There's 7 days in creation, 6 in the creation, 7th was the Sabbath. You've always, interesting here, and also when Moses goes up to Sinai, Jesus knows what's going on. He's 6 days on the mount, but on the 7th day, he's called actually to enter into the greater mystery of God. 6 pots, Jesus is there for the water into wine, and in that sense, Jesus is the one who brings us the 7th jar on which the water will be turned into wine. So 6 and 7. So when we see 6 jars, it's just not literally 6 jars. It's in fact drawing from the Hebrew tradition of 6 and 7, both in Moses at Sinai and the Genesis creation period, and then the day of rest. And so the 6 jars in Jesus become the 7th in that sense. Probably a thing to note here also, when John mentions this is the first of parables, he's using arche. I mentioned last week that arche can mean foundation. It can be the guardian of all things, as in the beginning was the word, at the ground, or the guardian of all things. If this was actually literally first, John would have used the Greek word protos, because that means first in Greek. He's using arche for a reason. He's also saying this is the first of the signs, the semeion. So in this sense, these miracles at Cana are signs or portals into something more deeper and significant. And John is careful in how he's using language for a very specific reason. So we look at 3, we look at 6, we look at 7 in that sense, and then obviously the water into wine. Again, what's going on is the water of our imperfect, our human, our natural life being deified and transformed into the wine of the eternal itself. And so this is again, Jesus is drawing from Hebrew myths, stories, history, to essentially articulate a journey ever forward. And one takes the key and unlocks the door, then the existential journey into our being grows ever deeper or more meaningful, and the transformation is properly understood. He's particularly at this place at Passover. Passover was historically the exodus politically from Egypt, but it can also be read metaphorically or allegorically as the transition from what we are not meant to be, our false self, the old Adam, the old Eve, into the new being. And so once again, Jesus is the Passover in that sense. And there's a reason that Passover is this is where Jesus is. And interesting, in the book of John, he's at 3 Passovers. And so he is the new Passover. Also, the temple scene where Jesus is at the temple. Most literalists, as with the Passover, there was the event, there's the ritual, and we leave it at that. But Jesus is saying there's more to the Passover than the historic event and the ritual. I am the Passover, which is going to move you to pass over into your new being. And so the temple itself, many Jews thought the literal temple, he's saying, I am the temple. And so this whole John 2 very, very much brings together a series of signs in that sense, which as you go through the book of John, each chapter is a clash between the literal and the allegorical, the typological. And inevitably what Jesus does, he moves beyond the literal. He uses the literal as a portal into himself, which is the typological or the Christological, but that Christological leads to the tropological, or the encounter between, like in the beginning was the Word, the Logos. In that sense, the very presence of Christ calls forth our being into who we're meant to be. And so the Christological links right into the ontological or existential, calling forth who we're meant to be, just as he called the early 4 disciples in John 1. So the Samaritan woman, she thinks literal water. He's talking about living water. So where do we turn to for meaning in our journey? Is it transient water, amusements, diversions, multiple attractions aplenty, or spiritual water? The same with the disciples come back. They're thinking they brought him food. He says, I'm full, I've eaten food. But where did you eat? Well, he's talking about spiritual food. This reaches an apex, of course, in John 6, where the literalists, he encounters them, and he's thinking, again, allegorically, tropologically, typologically, anagogically, where he says, you have to eat my body and drink my blood. Now, if you take that literally, and of course, all the chapters up to John 6 have been contra-literal reads. Again and again, John, through Jesus, has been pointing to a spiritual read of the text, rather than merely a literal read of the text. So it's almost the reductio ad absurdum in John 6. If you don't get it, these spiritual reads, then of course what you see Jesus saying is it translated literally into cannibalism, but he's not talking about literal. If it was, then of course whoever ate him the quickest would eat him, and that would be the end of the story. He's talking about eating spiritually. And so this is very important. I might also come back to one of the fine little Syrian theologians, St. Ephraim, Assyria, in his book, The Harp of the Spirit. He has in one of his, he refers to Cana. And again, you can see the Syrian exegesis of the text. So what Ephraim is doing, he draws right from the Cana thing. And he then has a whole poem. It's Hymns on Faith number 14, in which he draws from the whole Cana of Galilee, the wedding feast, and he does this allegorical read. You who are so just have had a wedding feast not your own. You fix 6 jars with good wine. Do you at this wedding feast fill not the jars, but the 10,000 ears with its sweetness? Jesus, you were invited to the wedding feast of others. Here is your own pure and fair wedding feast. Gladden your rejuvenated people, for your guests too, O Lord, need your songs. Let your harp utter. The soul is your bride, the body your bridal chamber. Your guests are the senses and the thoughts, and if a single body is a wedding feast for you, how great is your banquet for the whole church. And so in Cana for Ephraim, again we can look at it allegorically. Mary is there. So Mary can be read literally, Jesus' mother, and yet allegorically we are all Mary. There's the Theotokos Mary, but we all carry the birthing Christ within us, if we understand that properly. And we are all servants in that sense. So there's the literal servants who brought the water, but in that sense we are all servants within the body of Christ. And so the Cana of Galilee actually is the church in microcosm, or an allegory in that sense, because all the figures are there. The 3, the 6 to 7, the death, the resurrection, Mary, servants, wedding feast, and of course the feast, the wedding feast, is at the apex of all Christian exegesis. You begin in Song of Songs, and most of the early fathers, Origen particularly, Gregory of Nyssa, certainly Ephraim of Syria, Bernard of Clairvaux. At the very apex of the faith is this raising up of our spirit and soul to be united not only with God, Father, Son, and Spirit, but within the Corpus Christi, the body of Christ itself. And so the Cana of Galilee, when understood in its multi-layered portals, is a primer in that sense of the nature of the church itself. And so the Cana of Galilee story, when understood in more than simply a literal grammatical level, brings all these things together, which then will unfold through the rest of the book of John. As John says, this is the first, this is the foundation, this is the arche, this is the guardian of all the signs. And so when the Cana, or John 2, is unpacked, picking each part of it and stitching it together like a well-woven tapestry or a puzzle in which the pieces come together, they embody everything that fact is going to come after. So when we think sometimes of Philo of Alexandria pointing the way to Pontinus, Clement, Origen, in fact, Philo and the Alexandrians are standing on a much older tradition we find in Greek philosophy. Jesus and John are a part of that classical civilization, but what Jesus is doing, he's taking these layered levels of exegesis, applying them to himself, and then what that means for the new Israelites, the church in that sense.